Michael?
AJ, oh yeah, Mike.
Yep.
Just noticing as you spoke, you were saying on the path to God and your finger went up, as though it's up there somewhere. I'm just interested to know the God that you've mentioned a few times, and I have no fixed viewpoint on this myself, but I'm just interested to know from your perspective where your God is, what does he look like, what is this path, and where do you see him, her, up there, down there, or in here?
Very good question, Mike. Firstly, my God and your God are the same gods. But we often come at God from very different angles. And as you know from your own past, you've seen very different religious experiences in terms of people's viewpoint of God. If we talk about God for a moment in terms of God's attributes and characteristics, firstly, God I view as an entity. So let's just draw God as an entity that exists just like you are an entity that exists. Secondly, God has masculine and feminine characteristics and qualities. So I am just as correct calling God my father as I am calling God my mother. For the reason that God has masculine qualities and God has feminine qualities. And there are times in my own life where I'll connect with the feminine part of God, if you like, and there are other times when I'll connect with the masculine part of God. So even masculinity and femininity are what I would call part of God's attributes. Right? And all of you have attributes in a very similar way. There are parts of you that you have, like your personality, and God has personality too. So God, being an entity, has personality. And God existed before I was created. That being the case, God and myself are two separate entities. And God in fact created, so if we look at God, the souls that God created, of which you and I are one, you are actually a half and I am a half of soul. This entity, which is our soul, of which I am a half, and Mary is my other half. And this entity also is created with attributes and characteristics that are very unique. And those attributes and characteristics are unique per soul. So each soul is very, very different from any other soul. Now, because we are separate entities, one thing that God gave us was this gift of free will. In other words, I can act upon my own will totally independent to God. That being the case, I can actually do things that God would never conceive of doing.
God being where?
We'll leave that one on your abeyance just for a little bit first. I just want to illustrate the fact that we are actually separate entities to God rather than actually being God ourselves. So a common New Age belief is that I am God. Right? Whereas my feelings are I am God's son. I am God's daughter if I was a woman. So, and God gave us this gift of free will to demonstrate to us that actually we have a life totally independent of God if that's what we want to do. In other words, we can choose to live a life of what I would call self-reliance. Right? And the truth is that the majority of people on the planet live in that place of complete self-reliance, very little reliance on God. Even those that are living in religions, as you know, often are in complete self-reliance. You know, they're not trusting God at all in their life day to day. They might go along Sunday and do a few praises to God, which they may or may not connect to emotionally at the time. But the rest of their life they've spent very much doing their own thing, not really thinking about God much at all, and all of those kind of things. Many people are in that state. So the truth is that we are a separate entity to God. So one part of your question was, is God within us? Well, God herself, or God himself, is not within us. We are a completely separate entity to God. However, parts of God can enter us. And in particular, God gave us the ability to receive her love. So there is a specific process by which God gave us that ability. But we can actually receive God's love, which is love that belongs to her inside of herself, that we can open up to emotionally and actually have pour into us. And the majority of you here have had that experience at some point, where you've actually completely opened up to God. Now, oftentimes it's been when you're in the most darkest of situations in your life, and you completely open up to God, and something changes inside of you because you're so open. This divine love actually flows into your soul. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, perhaps. So a part of God can enter me, but that still doesn't make me God. It makes me more closer to God. And in fact, I use the term in the first century and now, that we can actually become at one with God in this love. In other words, so much of God's love can enter my soul that I now do everything the way God would have done it if God was actually on earth. Does that make sense? It still doesn't make me God, still makes me God's son, but now I am at one with my Creator, at one with my parent, at one with my mother or my father, you could say, and that at one-ment with God allows me now to live my life completely in harmony with all of God's laws and God's love. We have the capacity, every single individual has the capacity to enter that state. But that still doesn't make me God. I am still God's son. And in fact, I will, for the rest of my existence, be God's son. And there's no way, it's a bit like your daughter, for the rest of her existence, will always be your daughter. It can't change. Now, she will grow, she will change, she will have all sorts of different experiences. She'll meet maybe and marry, and who knows what else will happen in her life. She'll have children of her own, of which will be her children. But at the end of the day, she's always going to be your daughter in the sense that you got together and your seed created her, right? And we could argue that God created her, and we'll talk about that as well. But if you look at the analogy, you can see that actually she's never going to become your father, and she's also never going to become you. You will always be two separate individuals, in the same way that you are a separate individual from God. Now, God existed before all of the things that I've ever seen, and I've seen 22-dimensional existences. All of those things that I've seen, I have yet to see God in terms of in them. I've seen God's attributes in them. So in other words, I see God's love in them, I see God's wisdom in them, I see God's power in them. I see all of these attributes or qualities of God in all of God's creation. Right? But the qualities don't are more than the sum of its parts, if you like. So I could say you are a heap of atoms, but you are more than just a heap of atoms, aren't you? You are a heap of atoms with free will and a knowledge of your own self. That's pretty amazing for a start. But you also have an arm that can lift something. But you are not your arm. Your arm is an attribute or a connection to you. It operates upon your will. But you are not your arm. Your arm is a part of you. It's a subset of you. And it's the same with God's attributes and qualities. I can pick one of God's attributes and qualities, like God's love, and I can say that God is love, but love is not God. Do you understand the difference? I'm saying God has the quality of love, but love isn't the only thing God is. Like, God is much larger than love itself, because God has other attributes other than love, many of which I yet am to discover, and most of us are yet to discover. But God has all of these attributes and qualities which make up this being that I can become at one with, but never become. So I can never become God, but I can certainly become at one with God in the way that I love initially, and who knows, in other ways, there might be other ways in which I become at one with God too. But if we can understand it as us being separate entities, it's very powerful, because then what you start realising is that you can have a longing to open your heart to this entity called God, rather than thinking of God as an energy system. It's very hard to love an energy system. Maybe if I can put it into this kind of analogy. How many of you love the electricity plant down the road? Now, that's a provider of energy to you, isn't it? Like, in the morning, you probably get up and you probably, click the toaster on and chuck your 2 pieces of bread in there or whatever. You might put on the coffee urn or something like that, and all this energy is coming into your home. But you might love your toaster, but very few of us say to ourselves, oh, isn't it such a beautiful thing, this energy system that's over there producing all this power for me? And the reason why is because energy itself is very impersonal, isn't it? We can have energetic relationships with all sorts of things, but it can be very unemotional, every one of those energetic relationships. The truth is, with God, if we start seeing God as a personal being that we can connect to, you'll start connecting with God on this different level, like a parent. But not the kind of parent we're all used to having, because most of us have grown up with parents who at times have shut us down and at times have opened up, but very, very different for each person. But rather this loving parent who loves us at all times. And once we start seeing God like that, we can start connecting to God in a completely different way. And we can start having a personal relationship with God. It's very difficult to have a personal relationship with an electricity plant, aside from just putting on the power in the morning and turning it off at night. With God, you can have this constant personal relationship as a father to a son, or as a father or a mother to a son, or a father to a daughter, or a mother to a daughter, or a mother to a son. And you can have that personal relationship with God that can remain and grow the rest of your life. But if you don't see God as an entity and you see God just as energy, it's going to be very, very difficult to have that personal relationship with God. And my personal experience has been, over quite a long period of time, has been that actually God is an entity. And the more I think of God as an entity and less as an energy, the closer I get to God. And that in itself is proof that God is an entity. It's interesting when you speak with spirits, many of them have the viewpoint that God is an energy. And as a result of that, they have a very disconnected connection with God, many of the spirits who have passed. But as soon as you start speaking to them about God being an entity, and all they have to say is, if you are an entity and you have love to give me, then I would like to receive some of this love. And then they can actually feel love enter them. And then you ask them, and there's an experiment that I've done quite frequently with many spirits, then you say, well, now rub that out, stop feeling that longing that you have for God as an entity. Now let's say, if you're an energy, God, can you please give me your love? And ask the spirits what they actually receive then. And I've asked many, many spirits these questions. And on the second case, whenever they've thought of God as an energy, they've never received any love. But as soon as they think of God as an entity, they now receive love, which is in itself proof that God is an entity. Because love can only flow where truth is present. So the way I see God is an entity. God is bigger than all of her creation, just like you are bigger than all of your creation. So everything you have ever created, if you look at, the boat, the car, the caravan, anything that a man can put together, one person is greater than the sum total of all those things. And God is very much like that. In fact, we can learn so much about God just by looking at what God's teaching us through creation. And if we look at creation, we can make many assumptions about God that we can then test quite frequently and without very much error. And as a result, come to some very, very firm viewpoints about what God must be like. And then as we receive divine love from God, those viewpoints will either be confirmed or they'll be discarded, because any viewpoint that is in harmony with God's truth will be confirmed, and any viewpoint that's in disharmony with God's truth will be denied by God through the absence of love flowing. So that's how God can actually tell you the truth. So the beauty is you can connect to this individual who God is, who has masculine and feminine characteristics, but also has billions of other attributes and qualities, of which I can learn about, and I can connect through this connection of love that she is offering me, and I can feel and long for that love, and as I do, and as I open myself up to feeling that love, I can receive more of that love, and as I receive more of that love, the truth becomes well known to me. So instead of me being uncertain as to what God's nature is, I become more and more and more certain as to God's nature. So one thing that I feel quite now is that God is certainly never angry. And I know that for certain. Now, years ago, I believed God was an angry God. So years ago I felt that, God would punish the wicked, and, the whole Bible thing of he'd reward the righteous and punish the wicked. Now I can feel, because of this deeper connection with God, I can feel that no, that's not the case at all. In the first century, I grew up in this environment where everybody viewed God as a punishing God. They all had to appease God all the time. They all had to make God feel happier. And I realised after a short period of time, after feeling this connection with God, that actually nobody has to make God happier, because God's already happy, right? And if God wasn't happy, like, you imagine if God wasn't happy, like you're talking about the creator of the universe being unhappy. You know what you're like when you're unhappy. You imagine what God would be like if she was unhappy. Like when you're like, there's tears flowing down your face. You can't, if you really connect with your unhappiness, you can't do much at all. You can't maintain anything around the home very well. You get like, there's a lot of things. You imagine God in that place, like being unhappy like that. It'd be, the whole universe would go to pot within, a few instants. And because the universe is very dependent on all of God's happiness. And so we start seeing God as having these attributes and qualities that I can connect to. And the closer I get to God, the closer I become to reflecting those qualities and attributes in my own life. And so when I become at one with God, other people think that I'm God, but I'm still not God. I'm God's son. I'm still in this place where I'm allowing all of God's emotions and all of my own emotions, of course. And I'm in this really connected place, but I'm able to reflect divine love in all of my dealings with everyone around me. And that's what it's like to receive divine love. So does that answer a lot of the questions about who God is, who we are, and those kind of things? Now, I know you've been on a search for many, many years, right, about God, and you have this deep longing in your heart to connect deeper to God, which you can feel quite frequently. And I know much of your history has been about feeling that longing and feeling, yeah. Well, you can feel it. I know you can feel it, and I'm just describing your emotions. So the key now is just perhaps to experiment with a bit more truth, and just see how that affects this relationship that you've already got established with God, and see whether it grows or not. The key for all spiritual growth is experimentation, really, in the end. A lot of times we're so afraid to experiment because of our backgrounds or whatever. I know I was very afraid to experiment, because I was always afraid that God would maybe punish me if I experimented in the wrong direction. And the truth is that if you experiment in the wrong direction, you will feel the pain of that at some point. But if you experiment in the right directions, you'll also feel the pleasure of that. And the beauty of constantly experimenting is you get closer to God very rapidly if you allow yourself to see yourself in a feedback system constantly. So God is always telling us, this is the beauty of our Creator, is she is always telling us through lots of different means whether we're on the wrong track or we're on the right track. And pain actually in our soul is a great indicator that we're on the wrong track, and pleasure that's long-term and deeply felt is an indicator that we're on the right track. And it's a beautiful feedback system that we have. Now, I'm not talking about short-term pleasure with long-term pain behind it. I'm talking about the deep, peaceful happiness that comes from things. That kind of pleasure tells you you're on the positive direction. And that kind of pain, where you feel the pain of relationships, the pain of acting out of harmony with love yourself, that pain is always an indicator that something's wrong. Because God, it's not God that created pain. God just created the potentiality of it in our existence. We ourselves, through our will, create all of our pain. Yeah. So does that help with... Yep, if we can go...